On a bright Saturday in November 1987, Janice worked returns at a Walmart off I-44. In the case notes, a Walmart receipt would later unravel the one routine he couldn't afford to repeat. He set a plastic clock radio on the counter. No box, no manual, no fuss. Janice reached for the refund form and the stamp. Her manager had warned her on Tuesday, too many exceptions, and probation ended early. The man didn't complain about the price. He watched the printer. When the register spit out the return slip, he leaned in. Calm, precise. He asked for the receipt back. Not the refund, the paper. But he wasn't returning it for money. Janice hesitated, pen hovering. Company policy made the receipt the store's proof. She could void the return, but then she'd have to explain why. The man's eyes stayed on her hands. He'd folded the original receipt into a tight square, creased to death. He held it like a key tag, not like trash. Janice finally processed the return anyway. The drawer opened. The receipt tape advanced. She tore off the customer copy. It carried the timestamp and register line E1. The kind of detail nobody sees. He reached for it instantly. Janice did something small, almost automatic. She hit reprint. The machine whined and spit out a second strip. Managers hated reprints. She slid it under her palm. A thin strip of paper, a second shadow of the same moment. At the return desk, everything still looked normal. The man thanked her without warmth and took the clock radio back with him, like the object mattered less than the trail. As he turned away, the radio's speaker gave a brief hum, then silence. Janice watched him cross the fluorescent aisle and vanish into holiday shoppers. She told herself to forget it. Her shift ended at 9. She clocked out, counted change, and went home. The kitchen table was covered in overdue bills. 2 days later, she found the reprint in her apron pocket. Folded into the same square, the ink was already smudging at the edges. She should have tossed it. Instead, she tucked it into her wallet behind her driver's license because one line on it bothered her. A return code pressed hard enough to leave an imprint E2, like someone had trained him to make paper talk twice. She slid it into her apron pocket and felt the shift tilt. What else was hidden in that paper? By Monday morning, the reprinted receipt was still in Janice's wallet, folded into a tight square. The ink had already begun to gray at the edges, like it knew it wasn't supposed to last. Walmart opened early, and the building felt awake before the sun did. Fluorescent lights buzzed over blue vests and rolling carts. At returns, people lined up with dented toasters and wrong-sized shoes, hoping for an undo. Janice's job was to turn messy stories into neat paperwork. She stamped dates, she matched barcodes, she stapled copies together so the corner bites lined up. If the paper was straight, management assumed the decision was straight too. That was the deal she'd made with herself. Keep your head down. Don't be the reason someone has to call Bentonville. Don't make a scene. Because her own life didn't have room for scenes. Her paycheck was thin, and the kitchen table at home stayed buried under envelopes. Rent, utilities, the car. She circled due dates in red and called it control. At work, control was simpler. A return was either receipt, no receipt, or manager. Anything else became a problem with her name on it. Her manager, Mr. Dillard, kept a yellow pad by the phone and disciplinary slips in his drawer. On Tuesday, he slid one across the counter. Not a firing, not yet. Just a warning, E4, her name typed crookedly, a blank space waiting. So when she remembered the man with the clock radio, she didn't remember his face first. She remembered how fast her fingers had moved to hit reprint. The return process was meant to be boring. Scan, check the sticker, print the tape, staple it to the form, drop it in the tray. By shift's end, those packets were bundled and entered into the returns book E, 3 amount, reason code, employee initials. Paper made the store feel honest. Paper also made mistakes loud. Janice caught herself staring at the returns book when the line thinned. She flipped pages with a thumb stained with ink. Entries were blunt. Amounts, codes, initials, sometimes a customer name in tired cursive. She found her own entry for the clock radio return. Same amount, same register, her initials in the margin. And next to it, in smaller handwriting than hers, the name she'd copied off his card. It looked ordinary. 2 syllables, clean letters, no flourish. But it didn't fit him. He'd held the receipt like it was contraband, Yet he'd offered a name you'd trust with a casserole dish. Janice stared at it until a customer cleared his throat. She shut the book and went back to smiling. This was her normal. Refunds for cracked plastic, missing parts, buyer's remorse, people who argued, people who apologized, people who tried to talk her into breaking policy. The clock radio man had done none of that. He hadn't cared about the refund, he'd cared about the proof. Why would anyone want a Walmart receipt back after the register already swallowed the transaction? The question sat in her head all day. If she told Mr. Dillard she'd reprinted a receipt and kept it, she'd be admitting an exception with her own hands. If she threw it away, she'd be choosing quiet again. That night, the house was dark when she came in. She set her purse down and heard coins clink in the bottom like they were tallying her. She pulled the receipt out and flattened it on the coffee table. The fold lines made a tiny grid. The store number and timestamp were still there, but lighter now, like breath on glass. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. Then she remembered the way he'd watched her hands, not her face, not her name tag, her hands. A person who's nervous watches your eyes. A person who's trained watches your fingers. Janice folded the tape back into a square and slid it behind her driver's license again. It wasn't bravery, it was stubbornness, a small refusal to let the moment disappear. The next day, Mr. Dillard called her to the front office. The office smelled like copier toner and stale coffee. A schedule was taped to the wall with curled corners. He didn't offer a chair. He held out a thin packet of paper, stapled at the top left. The staple had gone in crooked, pinching the corner the way a bite mark pinches skin. "Short register," he said, tapping the packet. No yelling, no lecture, just that calm tone that meant he'd already decided what the day was going to be. Janice looked at the total and felt her stomach drop. It wasn't a huge amount. It was the kind of amount that could be a counting error. Or a return that shouldn't have gone through. She initialed where he pointed. Another note for her file. Another small weight added to her week. Back on the floor, she could still hear the store intercom calling for a price check. Life looked the same, but her hands didn't. By the time she reached the returns counter, she saw the same face in the fluorescent glow, and he was holding another receipt. The man at the counter didn't smile this time. He stood slightly off to the side of the returns desk, like he didn't want the camera above the aisle to have a clean angle. In one hand, he held a receipt. In the other, nothing. No clock radio on the counter yet. Janice felt her throat tighten anyway, because she recognized the fold. A tight little square, creased hard, the edges rubbed pale. "Hi," she said, and heard how fake it sounded. He slid the receipt forward but didn't release it. His fingers stayed pinched on the corner as if the paper could run. "This was wrong," he said. Not angry, not rushed, just flat. Janice reached out, and he let her take it only when she used both hands, like he wanted to see exactly where it went. The receipt was from that morning, but not from her register. Different store number, different cashier code, same item line. Clock radio. He waited until she scanned the barcode from the receipt. He watched the screen, not her face. "Do you have the item with you?" Janice asked. He nodded once and lifted a Walmart bag from the floor, placing it on the counter like it weighed nothing. Inside was the same model clock radio as before, the same bland plastic, the same cheap buttons that always felt sticky even when new. Janice checked the side sticker. The UPC matched. Then she noticed something she'd missed last time. A tiny serial number printed in thin black ink along the back seam. She copied it down on the return slip before she could talk herself out of it. E6, because something in her gut told her he would not want anyone to notice it. "Reason for return?" she asked. He didn't say, "broken." He didn't say, "didn't like it." He said, "wrong." That was it. Janice started the process anyway. She keyed in the code. The register word. Then he leaned closer, voice low enough that it felt private even with shoppers passing behind him. "No reprint," he said. Janice froze with her finger over the button. Yesterday, she'd hit reprint because she'd been curious. Today, the fact that he anticipated it made her skin go cold. He wasn't guessing. He was managing a risk. She printed the return slip once and tore it clean. One copy for the store file, one for the customer. Her training told her to hand him the customer copy and stapled a store copy to the form. Her manager's yellow pad was practically hovering over her shoulder. The man didn't reach for the money. He reached for the paper. "Give me both," he said. Janice shook her head. "I can't." He stared at her hands again. His eyes flicked to the stapler, to the tray where finished packets collected, to the returns book that sat half open, waiting for initials. It wasn't panic in his face. It was calculation. Then he did something that finally cracked her. "Maybe I'm overreacting," thought in half. He asked, gently, "You kept the last one?" Janice felt heat rise behind her ears. "I don't know what you mean," she said. He didn't push. He didn't threaten. He just nodded, as if her denial had been one option on a list, and he'd already planned for it. "Okay," he said, and took only the customer copy. He folded it once, twice, then into that same tight square. Perfect. Fast. Like a trick he'd practiced with his eyes closed. He picked up the clock radio, slipped it back into the bag, and turned away. And instead of leaving the store, he walked deeper into it. Janice watched him move past the seasonal aisle, past the end caps of holiday lights, until he stopped near a payphone mounted by the restrooms, one of the last public phones the store still had. He didn't pick up the receiver. He just stood there, looking at the wall as if he were reading something that wasn't posted. Then he set the Walmart bag on the floor, stepped away from it for 5 seconds, and came back. When he lifted the bag again, he was holding the clock radio differently, pressed tighter to his side, like he didn't want it visible. Janice's heart beat too loud in her ears. She looked down at her paperwork to pretend she hadn't watched, but her hands shook enough that the stapler clicked twice. At the end of her shift, Mr. Dillard called her name over the intercom. Not the office this time. The front lanes. He stood by register 6 with another supervisor, both of them staring at a thin strip of receipt tape stretched across the counter like a measuring line. "Why are there reprints on your terminal?" Mr. Dillard asked. Janice swallowed. I hit it by mistake. It was..." He cut her off with a small shake of his head. "Not mad. Worse, disappointed." "We're tightening this up," he said. "You're on probation. And difference is Zard of the first." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out the next week's schedule, and handed it to her without looking away. 2 shifts gone, 4 hours each. Not a firing. Not yet. A reversible loss if she behaved. Janice walked to her car with the paper schedule in her hand and the old receipt square in her wallet, and she understood the trap she'd stepped into. If she told anyone what she'd seen, she could lose the job she needed to keep the lights on. If she stayed quiet, she'd be helping someone who treated a Walmart receipt like a weapon. She sat in the driver's seat and stared at the store's glowing sign until her eyes watered. Then she made the safer choice. She drove home, and the next morning, the folded receipt was gone. Janice noticed the missing receipt before she noticed anything else. Her wallet felt thinner when she opened it at the kitchen table. The driver's license was there. The coupons were there. The little square of thermal paper gone. She dumped the purse out anyway. Lipstick, keys, 2 crumpled ones, a pen that didn't work, no folded square. For a long minute, she just sat there, staring at the empty space where it had been, like a tooth pulled clean, because it meant one of 2 things. Either she'd lost it on her own, or someone had taken the only thing she'd kept. At work, she tried to act normal. She smiled at customers. She scanned barcodes. She repeated the same apology lines until they sounded like a recorded message. But her eyes kept drifting to the doors. And to the payphone by the restrooms. That phone had always been part of the scenery. A place for kids to call their mom, a place for a man to check in with work. Now it felt like a stage mark. During her break, Janice went to the returns book, again E3, and flipped back through the last few weeks. She wasn't looking for names. She was looking for shapes. Same item categories, same reason codes, same price ranges. And then she saw it. Not one clock radio return, several. Cheap electronics that sat right in that sweet spot where a cashier could process it fast, under the amount that demanded a manager at the desk, but high enough to leave a clean line in the daily totals. A calculator, a pocket AM, FM radio, a set of batteries that always rang up the same, and every time, the paperwork looked tidy. Too tidy. She traced the entries with her finger, feeling the faint indent where the pen had pressed hard enough to bruise the paper. Then she noticed something she'd never cared about before: the store numbers. Some of the receipts were from their Walmart, some weren't. Different store IDs, same corridor of towns, same highway spine. It wasn't one odd customer. It was a route, a pattern you could drive. Janice closed the book, heart beating faster, and walked to the manager's office with her hands shoved into her vest pockets so no one could see them shake. Mr. Dillard listened, without changing his expression. That was his gift. He could make any problem feel like it belonged to the person reporting it. "You're saying a customer stole a receipt from your purse?" he asked. "I'm saying I had it," Janice said. "And now I don't. I too—" He stared at her like he was deciding whether this was drama or risk. Then he opened his drawer and pulled out a thin stack of forms, a daily refund summary, E7 numbers and columns, neat as a church ledger. He slid it across the desk. "You want to know what I've been getting heat for?" he said. "These." Janice scanned the sheet. Refund totals by day, by register, by cashier. She saw her initials twice and felt her stomach tighten again. "It's not just you," he added, almost reluctantly. "We've had a few weeks of weird. He didn't say fraud. He didn't say theft. Those words would require action. Weird could stay on paper. He leaned back. "Look, if you're accusing a customer, you better be right." "I'm not accusing," Janice said. "I'm scared." That was the truth, and it landed heavier than she intended. Mr. Dillard exhaled through his nose and glanced at the door, as if the walls had ears. Then he lowered his voice. "Talk to loss prevention," he said. "Not me. I'm 7th. Loss prevention." The phrase sounded official enough to hold her fear without laughing at it. The LP office was a cramped room near the back, with a corkboard of photocopied faces, shoplifters caught on grainy camera frames. A small TV played a loop of store footage. A coffee cup sat beside a stack of incident reports. The LP supervisor, a man named Ron, listened more carefully than Mr. Dillard had. He asked for the basics: date, item, behavior, words used. Janice didn't give him a speech. She gave him what she had: the man's insistence on the receipt, the warning about no reprint, the way he watched her hands, the way he drifted toward the payphone. Ron didn't look shocked. He looked annoyed. Not at her. "At the problem?" "You're not the first to say this," he admitted. Janice felt a chill move through her. "Other stores?" Ron tapped the desk twice with his pen, like he was counting beats. "We share notes. Regional." And, quote, he opened a folder and pulled out 2 photocopies of receipts blown up, dark, with the thermal print already fading. Different store numbers, similar items, similar times of day. "Same guy?" Janice asked. "Maybe," Ron said. "Or somebody doing the same play." He turned one photocopy toward her. The timestamp was circled. The register ID was underlined. And in the margin, someone had written, "Asked for receipt back." Janice swallowed. "So what do you do?" Ron hesitated, then made a decision. "I can kick this up," he said. "But once I do, it's not just a store thing." Janice understood what he meant without him saying it. Once it left Walmart, it became something that could swallow her life. She still nodded, because the receipt being gone from her wallet made the choice for her. That night, Janice walked into her apartment and stopped in the doorway. The air felt touched. Not messy, not broken, just wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. Her kitchen chair had shifted a few inches. The curtains hung the same, but the fold looked different. A small scuff mark near the doorframe looked fresh. Nothing valuable was missing, but her purse sat on the couch, open, as if someone had checked it and left it there on purpose. Janice didn't call a friend. She didn't call the police. She locked the deadbolt and sat on the floor with her back against the door until her legs went numb. This is where she was now. A grown woman scared of her own living room because of a strip of paper from Walmart. The next day, Ron pulled her aside near the stockroom. "Somebody wants to talk," he said. "Who?" Janice asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. He didn't say FBI. Not yet. He kept it smaller, safer. "Federal," he said. "Out of OKC." Janice's mouth went dry. Ron led her to his office, shut the door, and pointed at the chair. 2 men sat inside, both in plain clothes. No badges on display, no big introductions. They looked like accountants until you noticed how still they were. One of them spoke first, calm voice, Midwestern vowels. "Miss Harlan?" he asked. Janice nodded. "We're following a pattern of cash returns across several locations," he said. "Small electronics, consistent timing, consistent behavior." He said it like he'd practiced it, like he'd learned how to make it sound ordinary. Janice gripped her knees under the desk. Why? The man didn't answer the way she expected. He didn't say fraud. He said, "Because patterns are how people hide." Then he slid a copy of a receipt across the desk. Ewan's cousins, the same kind of paper, the same typeface, the same thin truth, store number, timestamp, register ID. He pointed to the time. "Do you remember what he did after the return?" he asked. Janice saw the payphone in her head, like a picture pinned to a wall. "He went toward the phone," she said. "But he didn't call. He just waited." The second man, who hadn't spoken yet, opened a notebook and wrote something down. A single line. No flourish. Janice realized they weren't here to be convinced. They were here because they were missing something, and she might be the piece. At this point, Janice still didn't know his name or his country, only that he kept coming back for paper. The first man nodded once. "We also have phone toll traces from payphones near these stores," he said, careful with his wording E8, "and we'd like to understand what he was timing." Timing. That word hit her harder than federal. Because suddenly, the receipt wasn't just proof of a purchase, it was a clock. A printed moment he could hold in his pocket and show someone else. A way to say, "I was here at exactly this minute." The man leaned forward slightly. "We're going to ask you to help us document the next time he shows up," he said. Cleanly, quietly. Janice felt the room tilt. "What if he notices?" she asked. The second man finally looked up. His eyes were flat, not cruel. "Then you'll learn what he's willing to do for a receipt," he said. Janice stared at the photocopy on the desk, at the circled timestamp, at the underlined store number, and at the idea that a Walmart return desk had become a place where someone could be hunted. The first man slid his card closer. No agency printed in big letters, just a name and a phone number. "If you see him again," he said, "you call." Janice reached for the card. Her fingers touched the paper, and she felt, for the first time, that the safest part of her life, the boring part, was already gone. The next time Janice saw the man, it wasn't on a weekend. It was a weekday afternoon when the store felt half asleep, fewer carts, longer echoes, the same song cycling overhead. She was back at returns because that's where they needed her, and because her schedule had already been cut down to the bone. Ron from loss prevention didn't linger near her anymore. That changed the whole feeling. Instead, he passed by like a stranger, pushing a cart of go-backs with one hand and eyes forward. The two federal men had told her that's what normal looked like when you were being used as bait. Janice's apartment still felt wrong every time she unlocked it. She'd started leaving a strand of hair across the doorframe at night, not as a trap, as a question. Some mornings, it was still there. Some mornings, it wasn't. At the store, the plan was simple enough to explain without sounding like a plan. If he came to returns, Janice would do what she always did. Scan, key in the return reason, print the slip. She would not hit reprint. She would not keep anything in her pocket. She would not look around like she was hoping to be rescued. And when she heard the printer finish, she would tear the store copy clean, staple it to the form, and slide the packet into the tray like it meant nothing. Because the packet did mean nothing until it meant everything. The agents had explained the receipt obsession in a way that made her stomach go tight, not with spy movie language, with accounting language. They believed the man was building proofs. He could hand off, time-stamped, store-numbered, ordinary little alibis that didn't require a face-to-face meeting in daylight. A Walmart receipt was perfect for that. It showed he'd been somewhere, buying something forgettable at a minute he could point to later. And no reprint mattered because an extra copy was an extra unknown, something he couldn't control, something he couldn't explain if a handler demanded the original. That was the first time Janice understood why he'd wanted the paperback more than the refund. He wasn't protecting money. He was protecting a schedule. The man appeared just after her break, like he'd been waiting for her to return to the counter. Same posture, same careful distance from the camera's clean view, same folded square in his fingers, But today he brought something different. A small tape recorder. Not in a box. Loose, like it had been carried in a coat pocket. He placed it on the counter gently, as if it could bruise. Wrong, he said again. Janice swallowed. Do you have the receipt? He held it out, and she took it with both hands, forcing her fingers not to tremble. She kept her face neutral, like she'd never seen him before in her life. Behind him, the seasonal aisle glowed with cheap garland. A child laughed somewhere near toys. The world insisted on being normal. Janice scanned the receipt. The register chirped. The screen filled with the same boring text she'd stared at for years. She checked the item. She checked the serial number fast, practiced now, then wrote it down on the return slip without pausing, like it was part of her job. The printer started, and the man's gaze locked onto her hands with a hunger she couldn't mistake anymore. When the receipt tape fed out, he shifted his weight. One step closer. Not aggressive, just close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. Janice tore the customer copy and started to hand it over. He didn't take it. He looked past her shoulder. Not at the returns line. Not at the manager's office. At the front doors, Janice felt the air change. The kind of change you sense before you understand. A man in a ball cap stood by the entrance, pretending to read a flyer taped to the glass. Another man lingered near the payphone, too still, too empty-handed. They were supposed to blend in. They didn't. The customer's eyes flicked back to Janice. A faint expression crossed his face, almost relief. Almost amusement. Like he just confirmed what he'd suspected? Then, he did something that turned her blood cold. He reached across the counter and grabbed the store copy before she could staple it. His fingers closed around it, crushing the paper into his palm. It was a small motion. A petty theft. The kind of thing you'd normally handle with an annoyed sigh and a call for a supervisor. But his hand didn't move like a thief's. It moved like a man retrieving a missing part. Hey, Janice started and forced her voice to sound workplace appropriate, not terrified. Sir, I need that copy. He leaned in slightly. No, you don't, he said, quiet enough that it felt like a secret. He slid the customer copy into his pocket without folding it, like he didn't have time. Then he picked up the tape recorder and turned away. Janice's heart hammered. She made herself do the only thing she'd been told to do. She stepped back from the counter, reached under the desk, and pressed the small call button that sent a silent alert to loss prevention. Ron appeared within seconds, moving too fast to be casual. The man didn't run. He walked straight toward the payphone, straight toward the exit. And as he passed the end cap, he looked back once, right at Janice, long enough for her to understand the real shift that had happened. This wasn't just her watching him. He was watching her back. Outside, somewhere beyond the glass, cameras would be clicking E10 license plates, faces, the angle of his shoulders as he crossed the lot. Inside, the missing store copy would be logged as a stolen document E9 because now it wasn't a receipt. It was interference. Janice stood behind the returns desk with empty hands, feeling the weight of what she'd just triggered. She had crossed the line into his attention, and she didn't know what he would do with that. The call came that night, not to her apartment, but to the payphone outside the laundromat 2 blocks over. Janice didn't answer it. She was in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off like a weak heartbeat. She learned about it later secondhand carefully because the men in plain clothes weren't only watching the Walmart, they were watching the spaces around it. The places a person used when they didn't want a phone tied to a name. And the moment the clock hit the same minute, printed on the stolen store copy, that payphone rang. Once. Then again, then stopped. The next day, one of the agents met her in the LP office before her shift started. He didn't look tired. He looked sharpened. He tested us, he said. Janice kept her hands clasped, knuckles white. How do you know? Because he changed one step, the agent said. He made sure the only thing that stayed consistent was the receipt. That sentence landed like a stone. So it really was a clock. Not the plastic radio, not the tape recorder. The receipt. A time-stamped permission slip that said, "This is when I was safe to move." They didn't tell her everything. They couldn't. Or they wouldn't. But they explained enough for her to understand the shape of it. He'd been building a chain of ordinary proof, store to store, week to week. Receipts that looked like nothing. Returns that looked like boredom. a route that could be mistaken for a man who traveled for work, except he didn't want a record of the return inside the store. He wanted only the kind he could control. That's why he'd grabbed the store copy from her hands, because a store copy stayed behind. A store copy could be audited. A store copy could become evidence. If it existed, Janice swallowed. So what happens now? The agent slid a new sheet of paper across the desk. No letterhead, no big seals, just typed bullets and a time window. A plan without decorations. If he comes back, he said, you do what you did yesterday. You keep your face flat. You don't chase him. You don't argue. And if he reaches for the store copy again, I let him take it, Janice finished, voice thin. The agent nodded once. We already have the pattern. Dole and Al. That was the first time she understood something else. She wasn't the hook anymore. She was the witness. The next appearance came 3 days later. He didn't head to returns right away. He walked the store first, slow, passing the aisles like he was sampling them with his eyes. He paused at sporting goods, then automotive, then hardware places, with wide sightlines and fewer employees. Places where you could see who was watching. Janice stayed at her station and pretended to be busy with a customer who wanted to return a blender without a lid. But she tracked him through reflections. A convex security mirror, the shiny edge of a freezer door, the glass of the front windows. He finally came to returns with a different object, another small electronic, another cheap shell of plastic, and the same folded receipt square. Wrong, he said again. Janice scanned. She checked. She keyed in the code. Her hands felt like they belonged to someone else. The printer started. The man's gaze dropped to the receipt tape like he could taste it. Janice tore the customer copy and held it out. His fingers took it instantly. Then he reached across the counter fast, practiced, and took the store copy too. Janice didn't flinch. She didn't try to stop him. She watched him fold both copies into separate squares with the same tight, brutal precision, paper made obedient by force. Then he did the part that showed he knew the room wasn't safe. He didn't walk straight to the doors. He walked to the payphone, lifted the receiver, and dialed one digit before hanging up. A fake call, a signal, a test. And then he left the store with the electronic under his arm like he'd simply changed his mind about a purchase. Outside, the parking lot looked like every other parking lot in America. But the agents were ready this time. They didn't grab him in the store. Not dramatic, not loud. They let him drive. Janice watched through the front windows as he crossed the lot and got into an older sedan. He didn't hurry. He didn't scan wildly. He drove like a man who didn't believe anyone would touch him. The agent who'd been near the entrance walked out a minute later, unhurried, holding a soda like he was just another customer. Another car rolled away from the far end of the lot. Then another. They weren't chasing. They were closing a net. Janice didn't see what happened after that, not directly. What she learned came in careful slices over the next week. They followed him to a roadside spot that looked too plain to be important. A small park, a drainage culvert, a stretch of scrubby trees along a frontage road. Somewhere no one would remember, because there was nothing to remember. A place where you could leave something and come back later. A dead drop. They found it because the receipts told them when to watch. And because the stolen store copies told them which returns were designed to vanish from the store's internal story, the agent said it without romance. They recovered a container from the drop and sent it to a Lab E12, along with the receipts and return slips that had been preserved in Walmart paperwork. Paper met paper, ink met pressure marks. A chain of ordinary documentation became a chain that could hold weight. They didn't need a confession first. They needed a link that would survive scrutiny, L6, something clean enough to stand up in court and in the quiet rooms where counterintelligence lived. They got it. When the agent told her they'd identified him, Janice expected a name that matched the return log. Instead, he said, "That's not who he is." Janice stared at him. Then who is he? The agent didn't give her the real name. Not fully. He gave her a description of the problem. An identity built in layers, verified in small places, reinforced by boring proofs like receipts and mail drops. An illegal life that didn't rely on diplomatic cover L3 because it wasn't supposed to exist at all. Then he said something that finally made her cold all over again. "He took your receipt from your wallet," the agent said, "because he believed you were the only loose end." Janice's throat tightened. So he came into my apartment. Boyne, the agent didn't answer yes or no. He didn't have to. The arrest itself was quiet. No shouting, no hero poses, a stop on a road, a request to step out, handcuffs, briefly visible, then gone behind a car door. And just like that, the man who treated a Walmart receipt like it could kill him disappeared into federal custody. Janice should have felt relief. Instead, she felt exposed, because the moment the investigation turned real, the store turned on her. Mr. Dillard called her into the office with Ron present, both of them suddenly very careful with their words. There have been policy violations, Mr. Dillard said, tapping a folder. Exceptions. Procedures not followed. Janice stared at the folder and realized the cruelest part. Everything she'd done to help would be described in the language of mistakes. Reprints. Irregular handling. Failure to secure paperwork. The same paper trail that had saved the case could bury her job. I did what you told me, she said, voice shaking. Loss prevention. Ron didn't meet her eyes. He looked at the desk. Mr. Dillard slid a form toward her E14, another thin sheet with blank lines waiting for her signature. It wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a spy thriller. It was a workplace exit. Janice signed with a hand that felt numb. When she left the office, the store sounded the same as always. Shopping carts, beeps, muzak. But to her, it was all radio static M2 without a song underneath. She walked out into the parking lot holding a final piece of paper she didn't want, thinking about the man's folded squares, thinking about how small the trigger had been. A clock radio return, a reprint button, a receipt that refused to stay thrown away. Word count to 1,020 estimated, within the 900, 1,150 range. Continue to part 7? Yes. No asterisk asterisk. Yes. Part 7. Aftermath target to 820 words. Janice didn't tell her neighbors why she was suddenly home on a Thursday morning. She just said, schedule changed, and smiled the kind of smile that ended questions before they started. The termination form E14 sat on her kitchen table for days. Not framed, not crumpled, just there, like a bill. She kept picking it up, reading the same dry language, then setting it down again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something fair. Policy violations, procedure, risk. Nothing about the man, nothing about the way her apartment had felt touched, nothing about how she'd learned to hear a printer whine like an alarm. She called in applications to other stores, other counters, other jobs that promised stable hours. Everyone asked why she left Walmart. She tried a few versions of the truth and found they all sounded insane, so she practiced the smaller answer. Management changed, she said. It wasn't a good fit. On the outside, the case moved forward without her, carried by people who could keep their hands clean. Once, one of the agents called to say thank you. Not warmly, not coldly, just professionally. He told her the court process would take time, that there were sealed pieces she wouldn't see, that her name would likely never appear in public the way she imagined it should, because attention was its own danger. He did give her one thing that sounded like closure, a plain summary of the outcome E13, spoken carefully, without details that could become a story on their own, enough to confirm she hadn't imagined the pattern, enough to confirm that the paper had mattered. Then the agent's tone changed, almost imperceptibly, and he said, "You did the right thing." Janice hung up and stared at the phone for a long time, because right was a word that didn't pay rent. She tried not to become someone who looked over her shoulder at every grocery store. But the habit built itself anyway. At the gas station, she watched the receipt spool print and felt her pulse pick up. At a diner, she tipped in cash and didn't take the slip, then changed her mind and took it, then hated herself for it. The world was full of thermal paper, and now she understood it as a kind of language fragile, fading, but capable of pinning a person to a minute in time. That's what made her angriest. Not that the man had used Walmart. That he had used ordinary. He'd used the place people went when they needed socks and detergent and batteries. He'd used boredom as camouflage. He'd used the fact that no one cared about a clock radio return. And he'd almost gotten away with it because the paper was designed to disappear. Thermal ink fades. Receipts crumple. People toss them in the trash without thinking. But Janice kept thinking. One night, weeks after the arrest, she found herself driving to the Walmart parking lot without planning to. She parked at the far edge, where the lights didn't reach as hard, and sat with the engine off. The sign glowed the same. The doors slid open and shut. People moved through their lives with carts and kids and conversations that didn't include words like counterintelligence. Janice watched the payphone spot near the restrooms and realized the phone was gone, a blank patch on the wall where it used to be. She didn't feel safer. She felt like the store had erased the evidence of how close it had come to being a meeting place for something terrible. She drove home and, for the first time, opened the small box in her closet where she'd been storing important papers. Not important like deeds or diplomas. Important like survival. She slipped a termination notice E14 into the box. Then she paused, because there was one other thing she'd saved. Not the receipt she'd reprinted. That one had been stolen from her wallet, and she still didn't know exactly when. But she'd kept one small square of paper from the weeks after the kind of thing she used to throw away without looking. A meaningless store receipt from a gallon of milk and a pack of gum. She unfolded it and stared at the timestamp. Then she folded it again carefully into the same tight square the man had made, crease by crease, until it became a little paper tile. It felt ridiculous. It also felt like taking something back. A few days later, she got a call from an unknown number. Her throat tightened before she even answered. It was a new employer offering her a cashier position at a hardware store across town. Less pay, fewer benefits, different uniform. She accepted immediately. After she hung up, she stood in her kitchen, holding nothing but air, listening to the refrigerator hum, listening for radio static that wasn't there M.2 until she realized the quiet wasn't a warning. It was just quiet. Still, she kept the folded square receipt in her wallet. Not as a trophy, not as a souvenir. As a reminder that the smallest piece of evidence is only small until someone decides it matters, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a spy's pocket isn't a weapon. It's a strip of paper that proves exactly where he stood down to the minute when he thought nobody was watching.